Hi YouTube, it's Catherine Michelle. Today I had a meeting with Dr. Leon Kelly from the El Paso County Coroner's Office. He's a medical examiner and he helped me to understand the autopsy reports. We didn't discuss everything in them, but we discussed a few topics that we will be going over in a minute. However, he did ask me, though. He was kind of uncertain as to why. He asked me, he's like, well, why are you researching this? He goes, what got you interested? And I said, well, I had been watching a YouTube video, caught my attention about 4 months ago, and I said I just started really digging into it. And he's like, so that's it. He goes, let me get this straight. He goes, you saw a YouTube video and then you just took it from there? And he says, do you know anybody in the case? And I said, no. I said, I don't have a monkey in the circus. I don't care if he's guilty or if he's not guilty. I said, just after reading the reports and putting everything together, I can't see that he's guilty. And I said, that's right. I just saw a YouTube video and it caught my attention, so I decided to start researching it. And so far, these are my notes so far, just so you can see what I've been doing. And this is not even all of the reports yet. That's only about half of the available reports, and so I'll be adding to this binder. And and he asked then what my experience has been. So I figured, most of you know that I was an EMT. I went to nursing school. But what a lot of you don't know is that research has been a passion of mine for a very, very long time. One of the biggest cases, I guess you could say, I did research on was on the Robert Logan and Mike Logan case. A book was written about their convictions as murderers, and that book was called Evil Intentions by Ronald J. Watkins. Now, how did I get to come to know them? My mother married Robert Logan, and at the time I had just had a book published, and it was an intrigue. They call it romance intrigue, but for me it was mainly intrigue novel. But you can't, if publishers want to publish it, you have no say where they're going to put it. So anyway, when they found out that I had written a book and had it published, then they wanted me to look into their case. So I bought the book, Evil Intentions, and I started reading it. And again, a whole lot in that book was just like, okay, how they investigated it didn't make sense, didn't make sense, didn't make sense. And again, I didn't care. I had no allegiance to either one of these guys, zero. I mean, they were in prison for murder. So, and even if they weren't, if they were still on trial, just because my mother was married to one of them, does not mean, again, it would be, I'm going to take my mom's side. That's not how I operate. And in fact, I've even turned my own brother in when he stole merchandise or equipment from a college. I have no allegiance to anybody once they do something wrong. Right, wrong, or indifferent. If you're wrong, I'm not going to be your buddy to hide your crime. So, and with the Logan brothers' crimes, they both were convicted. Robert Logan has since been released from prison. Mike Logan, who I believe it was Mike Logan and Jesse Gillies who were the main characters in the book Evil Intentions. Mike will never get out. He has a life sentence. Jesse Gillies was executed. And I spent 4 years researching that, making multiple trips down to Arizona. They were to the different prisons. They weren't always in the same prison, so I would have to make trips and get special permission, because down there, if you have one family relative on an inmate's visitation list, you can't have another one. So I had to write in advance and get special permission, and I had to tell them what I was doing. And then again, you had to get permission to have pencil and paper, because those things are not allowed. So I spent 4 years researching these crimes. Now, a lot of the inconsistencies I found and the lack of investigation on the part of the Arizona Police Department, it was appalling. They did a really poor job. However, what they did get right, these guys were guilty. Guilty as the day is long. And they both admitted it. But they were looking for an easy way out, and they were hoping that I could get Jesse Gillies off or get his sentence reduced because he was sentenced to death. So the day came when the state attorney's office contacted me and asked me for my research, especially where it was referring to Jesse. And that was really difficult for me. Not because I didn't want to share it, but because I told him, I said, what I have is not going to help your client. And I don't want to feel like I'm going to be responsible. Even though I knew I wasn't responsible for his death sentence, I didn't want to be like, he had one last-ditch effort and they were looking for my material. And I kept saying, please don't, just, this is not what you want to see. But they insisted, so I sent it to him. And about a month later, he was executed. So it took a long time to deal with that. And the hard part was knowing he was guilty and what a horrible person he really was. Not nice. But, long story short, my research days go way back. And so when I find something, I just don't go willy-nilly. Oftentimes it'll seem like I'm going in circles because that's what I'll do. I'll find something, go, wait a second, something here isn't sitting right. I'll research that, come up with a different idea. And then I keep going until finally everything is condensed into the best answer that can be proven. What you think you know doesn't matter. It's what you can prove. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting. He asked, so there's a little bit more of my background. And the last job I had, I did a lot of research at my job, and it was a government contracting facility. And so I did a lot of research for them as well. So I have a real different way of researching, and it may not agree with what everybody says. And when I come out with something, that's why I say at this point, this is what I think, this is what is making sense to me. And then it'll come back later when I get other people's information. Like today, there's going to be some changes because of what Dr. Kelly, how he explained to me the reports. And I have no problem with that. I don't understand everything, and it's good to get somebody's opinion who deals with all this stuff. So, what I spoke with Dr. Kelly today about, I asked him his background, and he has been a medical examiner from 2007 until present. He got his degree at Indiana University, and he's done right around 4,000 autopsies in his life. He specializes in strangulation and sudden infant death. He does not have a forensic background, although he understands some of it. It's not his core background. So he was able to help me understand some things, but he couldn't explain everything. Or what I appreciated about him is he said, well, this is how I understand it, but there's not enough information, and my opinion doesn't count, which is true. Our opinions don't count. And so I asked him if he had, and then the first thing I gave him were the autopsy reports of David, Komel, and Raniya. And that's all he read at first. He read those, and then I showed him a photo. And so I asked him, I said, do you have experience with small to medium-sized dogs scavenging on human remains? Sorry about that. And he said, yes, a lot of experience in that area. And I said, would you conclude a dog ate the hands of a victim if the arms are located under the body with no signs of the body being moved by the dog to gain access to the hands? And I was reading this from the police report. And he said he would not make that determination. He said because there's not enough information to interpret. He says, the way I was reading it, the hands are like this. He says the hands could have been like this. They could have been like this. He said there is not enough information to make that determination. I said, okay, or to interpret in that way. I said, okay, makes sense. And I said, and if dogs are chewing, I go, are there usually teeth marks on the bones and skin? And he said, at the end of the skin, no. But on the bones, he said not necessarily. It would depend on how the dog scavenged, how fresh the bones were, and how long the body had been decomposing. So again, it was another one of those, it's a supposition, not necessarily something he could answer yes or no in this case. Then we talked about, I showed him the photo, and I said, if you walked in fresh to the scene, what would your first initial gut reaction be? And he said, my first thought would be, where's the dog? So he said that he truly feels like the dog did scavenge and did eat some of these body parts. He doesn't know if it was all of it. Again, there's just not enough information, and I haven't seen all of the photos. He said he would have to see the photos on exactly how those bodies were laying. But right now, with what we have, he said there's just not enough information. And then I asked him, and I also asked him, I said, well, I'm still trying to find that report. I know I read it several times where they state the dog was thin and dehydrated. So I asked him, I said, could a dog be dehydrated if it had been sustaining itself on human flesh? And he said, yes, it could be dehydrated. So that was helpful to me. And then I said, how far advanced is decomp if the internal organs can be weighed and measured? He says, as long as there's some kind of fluid, if they're still there, they will be taken out. If they have to be scooped or whatever, then they're measured. And it also depends on what the moisture content is of not only the room, but of the body, and how far is decomp. And then I asked him, I said, I was told lividity can't be discerned once a body is refrigerated. And I said, is that true? Because I did get that from a deputy coroner from another state. I asked them about this. And they emphatically stated that once refrigeration happens, it changes the body and how the decomposition is reacting. He said in his experience, though, it's the opposite. He said, that the line of lividity will always be present. He said, as the body decomposes, blood and liquid is what leaks through, and lividity is blurred. So you might not be able to see it as well, but he says it's there. I guess, now this is me putting words into his mouth. This is what I understood him to mean. So as they start to do an autopsy, as they're cutting through, you might not be able to see it due to the decomposition, the marbling and the slippage. But I'm going to assume that once they start to cut, then you might be able to see the line of lividity somewhere on that. But he says it depends. But he said usually it's there, but it's going to be blurred, so you have to know what to look for. And then I said, can you determine approximate time of death with the last date known to be alive, the decomposition, and the room temperature? Because they were stating that the Crowleys died approximately 3 weeks before they were found, and so on and so forth. And he said no. He said no one can. A very rough estimate, but no one should determine. However, looking at the decomposition from the photos, he says his rough guess would be that they were not dead for 3 weeks, that they were only dead from a few days to a week. That is what the decomp process looked to him, only to that stage. He was very, very clear that he does not feel that those bodies were laying there for any longer than a week, which is interesting. I found that really interesting because everything states that the bodies had been there for 3 weeks. And I even told him that the glass door was cracked 1/4 of an inch, that the heat was set at 68, and all of that. And he goes, well, that can matter. However, the rate of where they were, the body with the marbling, and you could still see, and even though there was some mummification of the hands and feet of the feet that were bare, he said no. In his professional opinion, it was no more than a week. And then then I brought up the subject of the gunshot wounds, about being indeterminate, and I said, is the distance considered indeterminate in a gunshot wound to the head when stippling and gunshot residue is missing, yet there's a circular impression around the gunshot wound? he stated he doesn't know what the report means by impression. He said it could, my notes, my handwriting is very sloppy, just so you can see it. I'm having a hard time reading it. He says he does not know what the report means by impression, could be due to the weapon, or could be due to swelling of the tissues due to decomposition. So he said, again, they should not have used the word impression because there's no, he said sometimes as the tissues swell around a gunshot wound, that tissues can look like an impression, but that doesn't mean there's an impression there. It's just often due to decomposition. So he said he wouldn't say that. By what he read, he felt that that was not worded correctly. And then I said, would a circular impression around a gunshot wound be indicative of a silencer? He said, not necessarily. Again, not enough information. He said, could be, but that doesn't mean it was. And then I said, what does the description of decomposition tell you about the deaths? Who died first? Was there significant time between the deaths? And he said, there's no way to tell. He just said that they, let me think. I don't want to put words into his mouth. We might not have discussed that any further, so I'm going to leave it at that. He just stated that there was really no way to tell, but that they were all dead and dead for about a week. And so I asked him how mummification is influenced, and he says it's influenced by the environment as well as what the body part is resting on. Like if, and he showed me a photo of a body that had mummification of one hand, but the other hand looked, well, almost normal. If I saw that hand, I would go, okay, that's a dead hand. But anyway, there was a distinction between how the two looked. One didn't have mummification, one did. And he says that was due in part because of where these hands were resting. If it's like laying on a carpet where there's more heat going to be absorbed, the mummification process will happen faster. Whereas if something is either like someone's wearing socks or shoes, or if they're laying on a tile or a bare floor, then it's going to take longer to mummify. So that's why, probably why, there's really no definitives, but probably why David's feet in his hand and then little Raniya's hand that was resting on the floor were mummified, and then why Komel's feet were not. What else did we talk about? We talked about a lot of stuff. I have notes everywhere. Let me go here. And at first he was, when he's reading the reports and we're just going over the cursory part, and he started laughing. He goes, "Why are you even looking at this?" He goes, "It seems to me that the guy did it." And I said, I agree. At the cursory level, that's what it looks like. I said, however, when you start looking at things that don't make sense, I said, you have neighbors stating that they heard 3 gunshot wounds. There were 6 casings found. And when you look at the gun, only 3 shots fired. And then I said, because he asked too about the gun, he says, were his prints on the gun? And I said, yes, his and his daughter's prints were found on the gun. I said, however, on the gun safe, only the wife's prints were found. And he's like, well, that doesn't make sense. And I go, no, it doesn't. And then I showed him the notes, the submit to Allah now. And I know some people keep saying Alan, and I don't see an N there. I see an H. But I can't get a clear enough picture of that. You may be correct. It may say Alan, but it doesn't look like Alan, especially with what was written on the wall. And he'd asked about that too. He goes, well, what's that writing on the wall? And I showed it to him. And then I showed him David's handwriting. I showed him Dan's handwriting. And then I showed him what was written on the notepad and then what was written on the wall. And he's like, well, that's kind of curious. I said, exactly. It's not David's handwriting. And then too, what else did we talk about? Oh, the footprints, the supposed footprints. And I said, could you please take a look at this? So he's looking at them, and I said, can you tell me why in these photos, it's only the right foot, and that's the only foot that, if it is a footprint. Some of them actually look like a handprint, but I don't know. And again, he's like going, well, that doesn't make any sense either. And I said, I know. I said, now do you see why? Do you see why I'm continuing to investigate this? And he's like, well, yeah, you know. And so by the time I spent about an hour with him, wasn't enough time. We didn't get enough time to go over everything. And he did the best he could answering the questions I had. But by the time I left, excuse me, throat's dry. He had more questions than answers, just like we all do. So he went from at the very beginning, when he first just read the report and saw the picture, to, well, why are you investigating this? Because this could be what it is, to after I started showing him the police reports and then the BCA DNA reports, to he was like, huh, okay, this doesn't seem right. I said, well, now you know why I'm investigating it, because it just doesn't seem right. And that's kind of where we left it. I will be getting back in touch with him with more questions that I have, because I just didn't get a chance. I wanted to ask him actually a couple more questions that were very pertinent, but just ran out of time. And I'm really grateful to Dr. Kelly for doing this, because he actually put off a conference call he had with someone else to sit there with me for another 15 minutes to help, you know, kind of wrap up where we were. Let me explain. He did over the autopsy reports with the gunshot wounds. This was really, really important. Where is that? Okay, and then if I'm repeating myself, I'm really, really sorry. But he explained why it would be considered indeterminate. He stated that there are, I have to find that because it was made so much sense when he was telling me about that. Maybe I wrote it on the back of one of these pages. Yeah, I do that too, because I think it's really important that we understand how he explains the three. Oh, here we go. There are three types of terminology they use. Oh, it's so dry here. When they're writing up the reports. One being direct contact, where something is actually touching a certain part of the body. And then intermediate, where it's 2 to 3 feet away. And then distant, where there's no evidence other than the bullet. And intermediate, where it's 2 to 3 feet away, he says there will usually be gunpowder and stippling. And of course, with the gun press to the head, he said there will be stippling, gunpowder, and everything within that wound. And distant being the only thing they know. They can't say how far, because the only thing they found was a bullet or a bullet fragment. He did state that on Raniya's, of course, somebody had a question, and actually a few people have had a question about how to determine the entrance wound versus the exit wound. And he stated that, okay, I'm almost sure you said this. If you didn't, Dr. Kelly, please tell me that, because maybe I read this somewhere else. But with the entrance wound, there will be internal beveling of the, in this case, the skull, and the exit wound will be external beveling. So that's how they can tell the difference between the entrance wound and the exit wound. He said that, whose autopsy were we talking about? Oh, when they were describing, I think it was on Komel's gunshot wound, when they were talking about how it entered and where it was located, where they were talking about, you know, an inch from the head and a half inch from the shoulder. He said that that report was written by an amateur, probably somebody in training, because what they stated made no sense at all. And it was not written correctly. And he said, in the sense of calling them indeterminate, he says since there wasn't any gunshot residue or anything, at least I don't think there was on the bodies, other than maybe, then that would be the correct term, would be intermediate. And he said that their decomp rate for all three bodies is the same thing that they say in here, is early to moderate. Again, he stated only about a week dead. And he did feel, he was very emphatic in stating that he felt the dog did indeed do some scavenging, but without seeing photos and actually being able to read the medical examiner's report, which is different than the autopsy report. He couldn't say for sure which part of the body was scavenged or whatever. But I did ask him, I said, well, what about the fractured rib? Because he said, well, this was before he actually saw the picture of the bodies. And he said, just by reading the reports, he said, well, yeah, a dog could take the arm. I said, okay, now let's look at the photo. And I said, well, what about her fractured rib? And he's like, not likely. So again, there's a fracture to a rib. That doesn't explain anything. Does not explain. There's nothing there to explain how her rib got fractured. And I think that was pretty much all we talked about. He was also couldn't understand why they didn't do handwriting analysis, so that should have been done. And also he was curious on how the blood was actually located on the bullets and on some of the areas. He did say that just because there wasn't blood on the floor around where they were, he goes, that doesn't mean that's where they were shot. Okay, we've all said that too. However, with how they're laid, and at first he says it was, again, he said it was possible that David could have done this, until I pointed out that I said, well, but the position of David's body will tell you a different story. And he's like, what do you mean? I said, in the police reports, as they're describing it, and I went and I read him that part where, at least I think I read him that part. I read him some parts, but it's in here, where it describes that David is laying there, and then Komel and her sweater is laying on top of David's leg. And then that's when he goes, well, that shouldn't be. And I said, yeah, I know. And where the blood is located on the floor, and I'm not sure, I didn't do enough research yet on that to find out whose blood that was. But he said they were probably in a standing position and also at a low point where there's a low trajectory, because there's like spider going this way and then drops. So it's kind of a mixture. So they could have been standing and fell or something like that. But again, that doesn't make sense. He said dogs do lick up all the blood. I think that's my point I was getting to. And he showed me another photo of a body that had been eaten by this particular person's Labrador puppy. They called it a puppy, but I know Labrador dogs can be big, and I know how hard they bite. I've had one myself. So, but like I told him, I said, but that skull is still intact. The spine is still intact. All the soft tissues are gone, and I think most of the ribs were gone, but the skull is still completely intact. He said that could have been due to the fact that they believed that particular person died of a natural cause, but maybe the difference was because the Crowleys were shot in the head. Again, everything's speculation at this point because we don't have all of the information. So again, all in all, when he started off with a certain opinion after just reading the reports and then looking at the photo, but then as we're going through it more and more, and I start bringing out more of the questionable details that were bypassed, he wasn't quite as adamant anymore. He just got to the point where he's like, okay, yeah, there's not enough information for me to tell you one way or another. So I felt that that was pretty hopeful, because it was no longer, asking, well, yeah, the gun is right there, and it was that gun that shot the bullets, and they're the only ones in the house. And I'm like, okay, but you have a back door that's been opened. You have a fight going on between the brothers, and you have another sister trying to stir up trouble and, yelling at them in another email. And then Komel jumps in and says, hey, wait a second, we've had contact, and, you need to take it down a notch or two. But my interpretation, not hers, not necessarily what Komel said. And I said there was, and I also mentioned to him that I think it's Detective Klonikos, who was the electronics device investigator, how he went through every device that they were, they could pull from the Crowley house, and he could find zero, no motive whatsoever. And he went all the way back, I think, to early to mid 2000s, and so he's telling Detective Bone, he goes, I can't give you a reason. There's no motive here whatsoever. And there was some other, and again, he's not a detective. He just found that quite interesting. And I said, yeah. And I said, there's another guy who, Sean, I believe, is the one who owed the state of Minnesota like $38,000 in taxes, and how he's yelling at David saying, hey, you know what, why are you going to do this? Because you're going to send me to prison. And so the more information that he was, Dr. Kelly was getting, like I said, it went from, my take on how he was reacting, it went from, well, yeah, I'd say he did it, to not so sure. Not saying he did it, but I'm no longer saying he really did. So to me, it was great. It was good progress, and he answered a lot of my questions, and I think a lot of your questions as well. And the main thing being that until we can get better photos, he said he would like to see the actual photo of how the bodies actually were laying, the photo of how Komel is laying, and how her sweater's on top of David's leg, and just things like that, because that's extremely important. He couldn't have been standing to shoot himself in the head and then have his leg end up underneath her sweater. So it's these little details you have to pull out and go, okay, we got to look into this. So all in all, I thought it was really good, and Dr. Kelly did say he would answer any more of my questions that I had, and I know I'll have more because it was so rushed and so much information, and he did his best to go into it in depth as much as he could, and he showed me different photos of dog scavenging, and what I saw in those photos, they didn't resemble what I saw in the Crowley home. However, he saw similarities. I mean, he's the medical examiner, but I didn't see that type of injury. And in the photos that he showed me, every part that was exposed, that was bare skin, but when the dog was involved, it was gone almost, with the exception of the lower half of the extremities, waist on up, gone, down to the spine and the skull, gone. But the spine and the skull were there. So, which is totally different, because David had an exposed abdomen. Raniya had a completely exposed abdomen. Her face was not touched. Her head was not touched. Yet David's and Komel's heads are gone. So if any of you out there has better photos, or the one that especially shows how Komel was lying on top of her hands, and how the bodies were actually from a different angle, not the angle we have, please send them to me, and my email address will be down below. Thank you, and hopefully that will explain a little bit more, and I hope you got as much out of that with Dr. Kelly as I did. And again, I really felt that he was being very, very helpful. However, we have to keep in mind his specialty is not forensics, but he has experience in this particular area, but it's not his expertise. So, and he was, clear to state that, and he was very clear to state that his opinion, and nobody's opinion will matter. What you think versus where your expertise lies are two separate things. So, okay, thank you, Dr. Kelly, and I will be getting back in touch with you again. And I just, again, hope this helped you a little bit. And I think we're getting closer and closer to a resolution. And I'm now looking for handwriting experts. I'm going to be sending stuff off. Pay for it out of my own pocket if I have to, because I really think we have to do this with science. We have to prove one way or another. If he did it, it will be proven. If he didn't do it, it will be proven. I have my own take on it, and the more I look into this and the more I investigate and research, the more I'm going down that path. But we'll leave that for another day. So we'll talk to you later.